أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين. أما بعد, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to have you here for the first IsDB Resilience Forum. Before we go deep into the program, I would like to have the pleasure of inviting Khalid Ahmed to read a few verses from the Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى ووجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث صدق الله العظيم.
Thank you very much, Brother Khalid. وَأَمَّا السَّائِلَ فَلَا تَنْهَرْ. You have really chosen the verses that you have recited as we are going to talk about resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be here with you today, here in the great city of Marrakesh. My name is Muhammad Jamil Yusha, and I am from the Communications Department of IDB. I'm sure members and the participants in this great occasion are aware of the name Malcolm X. But perhaps what is not known very much about Malcolm X is his position on resilience. He is credited to saying that there is no better thing than adversity. For every defeat, every heartbreak, every loss contains its own seed. It's a lesson on how to improve your performance next time. So resilience is actually an opportunity so that we can do better. With this, I would like to have the pleasure to invite our Vice President, Country Programs, Dr. Mansour Mukhtam, to come and give the opening remarks. Can we give him a warm welcome, please?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Honorable ministers here present, representatives from development partners and participants, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuhu. It's with great honor and pleasure that I deliver this statement on behalf of the President of the Islamic Development Bank, Dr. Bandar Hajjar, who could not be with us here today because of scheduling challenges. I would like to thank you all for taking the time to participate in this important forum, which I hope will contribute to the global efforts to find solutions in addressing fragility and building resilience in ISDB member countries and across the globe for that matter. Fragility driven by man-made and natural resources is a global development challenge. Globally, fragility and conflict affect around 2 billion people. According to OECD State of Fragility Report in 2018, if no action is taken by the global community, 80% of the most vulnerable will live in fragile contexts by 2030. And 60% of the conflicts across the world take place in Organization of Islamic Cooperation region. Conflict, as we know, results in loss of life, disability, and displacement. Conflict also results in destruction of assets, weakening of governance, and breakdown of social cohesion. Inevitably, it reverses the gains of social and economic development. Equally, fragility traps hamper growth and prosperity and have negative effects at the institutional, social, and economic levels. Building resilience is therefore critical to addressing the drivers of fragility and conflict, ranging from social and economic exclusion to unequal development. Member countries need greater attention to conflict prevention and building resilience. The Islamic Development Bank has traditionally attached great importance to assisting member countries in addressing fragility, conflict, and building resilience, a commitment that is renewed through a more coherent and strategic policy to respond to these challenges. To this end, and with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the ISDB supports the implementation of SDGs, particularly SDG 16, which calls for promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development and building effective, inclusive institutions at all levels. Given its geographic proximity to fragile and conflict-affected countries and its preferential access as a trusted Islamic institution, the ISDB is a key partner in the regional and global agenda on addressing fragility and building resilience. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, I'm delighted to inform you that the bank has developed its first ever fragility and resilience policy, which was recently approved by the ISDB Board of Directors. And the aim is to set standards and strategic directions to the institution in its efforts to strengthen institutions, build resilience, and contribute to social cohesion and sustainable development in member countries. And drawing on the experience and challenges faced by the other MDBs, the policy accents a partnership approach, especially in focusing on prevention and bridging the important transition between relief and development, as well as supporting recovery and resilience. ISDB is committed to find innovative solutions that go beyond classical and traditional approaches to build resilience, to systematically respond to the risks and shocks posed by fragility. The bank is currently exploring, among other things, an innovative approach to mobilize resources for resilience through a network of developers and non-traditional partners, such as philanthropies and the private sector. Social investors and crowdfunding platforms also constitute our key targets, and then we have the blending of Islamic finance. So investing in private sector development and building resilient markets through value chain development to create jobs and economic opportunities for youth and women is necessary to address the drivers of fragility. Moreover, the Islamic Development Bank aims at finding synergies with the partners to the achievement of shared goals in the spirit of 2030 Agenda and current global initiatives. Building resilience to achieve sustainable development requires a good understanding of context and drivers of fragility to better design relevant and tailored development interventions. That is why the bank is organizing this first resilience forum to share knowledge and experience and perspectives and best practices. Lessons learned in building resilience to support member countries to address risks and their shocks would also be an important contribution to this meeting. And I would like to inform you that the ISDB has produced its ISDB Resilience Report, which assesses the situation of member countries in building resilience. I think copies have been shared. We will launch the full report in due course, but this is just a digest of highlighting the key findings and recommendations. During this forum, we'd like to hear your views on policies and strategies to support and manage transitions, construction, and recovery. I'm sure that the forum will be a platform to deliberate on challenges and opportunities of building resilience. It provides an opportunity for sharing practical case studies and successful programs, strengthening institutions, and building resilience, as well as fostering social cohesion, all of which are important for achieving sound economic and social development. And more specifically, I hope that the various sessions of the forum will also produce practical recommendations and solutions that can be included in country engagements, in country development programs, and in projects in these countries supported by the bank. Once again, I welcome you all to the forum and wish you success in your deliberations. Thank you again for participating in this important and high-level event.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, the Vice President, Country Programs. Whenever you are engaged in an activity, you try to put the people who will drive and lead your troops so that you can ensure success. It's my honor to invite the person who is going to lead us in this discussion, our own Dr. Walid Abdul Wahab, who is the Director General Country Relations and Services at the Country Programming Complex. Please join me in having the pleasure to welcome Dr. Walid Abdul Wahab. Dr. Walid will lead us in this discussion, and he will be the one to invite the participants and moderate the session as we go on for the remaining part of the day.
Thank you, Brother Jamil. Assalamu alaikum. I know we are encroaching on the time of lunch. Some people are still catching the last piece of dessert. Actually, I do have some introductory remarks, as you can expect, but I would like to make those while I have my colleagues with me. It's a bit more warm to have them. So I would like to call the four panelists, the speakers, and I will introduce them very quickly. So, Your Excellency, the Minister of Finance, you're still sitting up back there, okay? Farid Belhaj, Mansour Mukhtar, and Brother Kamal Bey, please. So we will join you on the table and we will go through my comments there. Thank you. Our Vice President said this is our first Fragility or Resilience Forum. Yes, we are catching up. As you know, resilience, which is the other side of the coin of fragility, is becoming main topic of discussion on development agenda and international stage. Fragility and conflict is now recognized as a global development challenge, just like when we talk about climate change, for example, or other global threats, or in fact, like we talk about SDGs. Now, it's difficult to find any global gathering without mentioning or having an event on fragility and conflict. Now, this is a huge topic, and I know we have 3 sessions in this forum. Our session is supposed to last about 1 hour, so we'll try to make the most out of that. But let me start first by giving you some figures, without the intention, of course, of giving you any hard feelings about the state of affairs in our member country, but it is reported that out of 36 fragile states, this is now, I'm using World Bank classification, 19 are IDB member countries. That's exactly half of the world fragile states. According to OECD classification, there are 56 countries that are experiencing fragile situation. This is a slightly different definition. And even here, half, exactly 27 of those countries are member countries of IDB. So it's easy to see that our countries are overrepresented. By the way, we represent around 25% of total population, or even by number of countries. We have 57 out of almost 200 countries, and our share in fragility is exactly double that. Now, the definitions, which I'm not going to go through, maybe some of the speakers may want to comment on that, is one of the key considerations in talking about fragility. For example, can we call Germany a fragile state because they just received, for example, 1 million refugees within a very short span of time? Compared, for example, to Turkey or Lebanon and Jordan that received almost similar numbers of refugees. And it's clear that the capability of Germany in integrating and receiving and people affected by conflict, which are called forcibly displaced, is different from, for example, Lebanon and Jordan, which happens to be among the highest indebted countries in the world in terms of total public debt, and they're already struggling economically with their own population and services. So that kind of definition is relevant to the debate on fragility. Since we are a bank, we need to talk about money and humanitarian needs, let alone recovery and reconstruction, are severely underfunded. According to OCHA, in 2018, only 38% of the global humanitarian appeals were funded. So this is just to meet the mere basic needs of the people affected by fragility. Out of 20 billion, I think there's about 6 or 7 billion that was cash provided to those people. Now, how does this translate into human numbers? I think the Vice President mentioned, if we count only the number of forcibly displaced people, again, in 2018, there were 68.5 million people. And listen to this, 70% of those came from 5 countries. They are all IDB member countries and almost from the same region, from the MENA region, unfortunately. They are Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, and Iraq. So I hope that this quick brush of things gives you enough understanding why we as an IDB and other MDBs and the whole donor community is paying attention to this as a global development challenge. Unfortunately, we still do not have a full understanding of the issue, the root causes of fragility, and when we do have the understanding, we don't seem to have effective and efficient mechanism to deal with fragility. We are still learning, all of us, and we would like and would hope that we can learn from each other. So to discuss these topics, and I would like to first now introduce the distinguished panel. We have His Excellency Dr. Abdulrahman Billi, who is the Minister of Finance of Federal Republic of Somalia, and His Excellency Kamal Emerge, who is the alternate governor for Turkey with IDB, and he's also a member of board of a number of banks, Council of Europe Development Bank, Black Sea Development Bank, and others, so he's very much into development sphere of the things. We also have 2 senior management members of multilateral development banks, Farid Bilhaj, who is the Vice President of the MENA region, who also previously was living in the region. He was for a while director of the Mashriq in Lebanon. And Dr. Mansour Mukhtar, my boss, who is the Vice President Country Program of IDB. Now, as I said, we are not going to cover the entire fragility issue. As you know, you see in the brochure, there will be 3 sessions. There are all kinds of issues to be discussed, so we'll try to focus on 3 points. The first one is country-led resilience and recovery policies, because that's very much an issue for countries that are going through fragility and building their resilience. Building state capabilities and renewing or building what is known as social contract, and I know Farid probably would like to talk about that. And supporting countries to cope with presence or pressure of refugees, and maybe Turkey would like to pick up on that point. So let me start with His Excellency Minister of Finance, Minister Billi. Can you share with us the story of Somalia and building resilience and the journey that you are going through in terms of recovery? And of course, here we're not talking about only physical recovery. We're talking about, especially His Excellency is leading his country's effort in terms of economic resilience, how they are trying to get back to the international community and become an active member of the international community in terms of development and building the state. Your Excellency.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Dr. Walid, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, the panel members, Assalamu alaikum. It's indeed a pleasure for me to be here representing Somalia, a very fragile country. As you very well know, Somalia has been called something worse than fragile. Just a few years ago, it was called failed state. Failed state is when you go 1 notch below the fragility. Then we came to fragile, and now we are recovering. So it's a good news that I have here for you. And I don't want to dwell on the bad part of that history. Only to say that Somalia was the only country that functioned for 20 years without recognized government. From 1992 to just 2012. There was no recognized government in that country. a country that has a big space and a lot of opportunities faced challenges that led it to have no government recognized by anybody. And therefore, can you imagine a country of about 15 million people, a country whose borders are very well known, with the longest coast in Africa, no government to talk to. So, you know, if you talk about chaos, that is the chaos that we were in. I am pleased to report to you, ladies and gentlemen, that today we are far away from that. We are becoming, we are recovering from those problems. And I want to thank the international community, including the Islamic Development Bank, to have helped us get out of the problem and to bring us to where we are. Today, we are still very fragile. The scars of civil war is still there. We are still struggling with terrorism inside the country. But we have come to realize that we have to put our house in order ourselves. International community can only help. And so today, we are working with the international community led by the IMF. Everybody knows here about the IMF and what they do when you are fragile and when you are in debt to everybody else. We are in debt, and therefore we are working on the areas. We are trying to capacity build ourselves so we can manage our resources better. We can deal with our problems better. We can come together and talk about issues. We have done that. We are increasing our governance issues. Very important element, governance, which means one's capacity to manage one's resources in a way that is in line with the rules and regulations set for the country. We want to thank the international community again for supporting us to be able to do that. The SMP program, Staff Monitoring Program of the World Bank, is what we are working on. And for the last 2 years, we have done, I say, something that's just short of miracles, coming from where we are, having a government that's recognized by the international community, being able to interface with everybody, talking about something that made sense to everybody else, recognizing what we owe, and also trying to cover our costs ourselves by putting rules and regulations that will guide our people to collect resources, to mobilize domestic resources to be able to cover the cost of running government. Today we are preparing for the spring meeting, which will have, for the first time, a round table for Somalia, which will discuss possibility of debt relief for Somalia. This was something that was not in anybody's mind just a few years ago. So we are recovering, and we are working on developing further the comparative advantage that we have. And that is the value chain development. We have livestock, as everybody knows. Somalia is associated with a lot of livestock. It is the only country that has a lot of livestock and sends this livestock overseas on the hooves without processing them. Bring all the sheep, all the sheep and goats and cattle and camel to the ocean, ships, and then ship them outside. Somebody will slaughter them, manage them outside. So that processing is not there, and I'm happy to hear that the bank is developing the value chain development. Same thing is true for the fish. The longest coast in Africa, and everybody knows also, those of you who don't know, we are very competitive, but the capacity has not been there yet. And we are focusing on that also, and I'm glad that the Islamic Development Bank is thinking about those things. Now, we are working on gaining trust of our people so they can pay the taxes on the basis of the rules and regulations the Parliament has approved. We are also working very hard to gain the trust of the international community. So what is the support that comes to us will be managed in a manner that is watertight and very transparent. And I think every year, year after year, we are gaining that trust. And really that is what satisfies us. When international community through the IMF comes to our country, They don't come to the country. We either go to Nairobi or some place in the airport is where we meet. We are working very hard that our country is safe enough for everybody to come and help us develop the potential that that country has. So that is what I wanted to say. I want to thank you very much for this landing to develop this.
Your Excellency, you covered so many topics, and just as a heads up for the next round, I'm going to come back some more to the upcoming meeting with the IMF and how you are putting Somalia back on the international stage in terms of governance and internal revenue generation and all these important points for regaining the trust of the international community. I'm going to go country, bank, so to be fair, and of course, as a host, our VP will go last. So let me now turn to Farid Bilhaj. Thank you for joining us in our annual meeting. Perhaps you can tell us about the World Bank and your personal experience in how best donor community can help countries affected with conflict and fragility. Should we just throw more money at this and we can solve it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, both broadly speaking to the annual meetings and obviously to this particular event. My very, very good friend here is asking me to be provocative, and I will not, for sure, let him down. So I will be provocative, and I will make a few points. One is that the whole concept of resilience, in my view, is the wrong one. Resilience means that you start from a place, you get a shock, you do whatever you need to do to come back to the place where you started from. Actually, this is wrong, because if you got into a place that made you fragile, that made you vulnerable, it means that your starting point was wrong. And this is where, when after the whole dynamics of the so-called Arab Spring, people started looking at the whole Middle East and North Africa region as a fragile region after years of the Middle East and North Africa region being looked at as what I would call stagnatingly stable. Nothing was happening. No reforms, no movement, no growth, but kind of broad stability. Everybody was kind of happy with it. And it's that time that we missed the huge opportunity, actually, to go about reforms and to go about things that would have actually prevented, possibly, what happened afterwards. Let's look at the issue of, what we called in the bank the flawed social contract. For years, the stability that we're talking about was based on, some kind of an arrangement between the people and their governments. The government would say, we'll give you free goods, health, education, transport, electricity, water, and then you please don't get in the way of politics. Well, that lasted many, many years. But that actually could not be sustainable and was not sustained. And we saw what happened starting from Tunisia and then the whole thing afterwards. That flawed social contract is something that we should be looking at very, very carefully and making sure that we will not go back to it, because that led us really to a situation where today, MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, broadly speaking, is seen as a very fragile part of the world. So this is the first part of it, and my whole conversation about resilience being not necessarily something that I'd like to bank on. I would rather, and my second point, move on reforms, on dynamics, on engaging, on making sure that the policies of the past are not the policies of the future. When one looks at all the region that we cover as Middle East and North Africa region, from Morocco all the way to Iran, and every single other country in between, all of these countries need to move on reforming their economy, on adjusting the parameters within which they were managing their economic drive. And this is at various levels, whether it is on sectoral issues or whether it is on broadly economic, in particular macroeconomic issues. And this is also something I would like to possibly go and work on and talk about slightly later. Third point, and Abdullah had mentioned it very clearly, the issue of continuum between humanitarian and development and security. This is something that we have been struggling with when actually with the ISDB we worked on the refugee crisis, on the Syria crisis, and impact on Lebanon, on Jordan, on Turkey at the time. And what we looked at the time is, we are development agencies. This is at face value, a humanitarian crisis. But in reality, our studies, our experience, our reading of history showed us that this humanitarian crisis, when it turns to become a multi-year phenomenon, well, it's not humanitarian anymore. It becomes a strictly, fundamentally development crisis. And when we look at how the SDGs were affected in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, and other places, because of the flows of millions of refugees into these countries, well, it is evidence that this is not anymore just a humanitarian crisis. And by the way, at the time, when in 2013, we started thinking about ways to help Jordan and Lebanon, the current Secretary General of the UN, at the time he was the head of the UNHCR, came by, and he was the one saying, you are better equipped to deal with this than us, because you will be getting deeper into the economics, so that we'll be getting deeper into a place that could prevent, the collapse of large economies and large countries. And I'll finish with this. Whatever we have done on that, whatever we have achieved, good, bad, and maybe not always, at the level of performance that we would have loved to be at, because nothing is perfect. But whatever we have done it together. We have done it with the ISDB. We have done it with a number of other partners, both bilaterals and multilaterals. Because if there is one lesson that we need to draw from this experience of the last 6-7 years, it's precisely that none of us can go at it alone. There is a very strong need for us to be cooperating, to be engaging together, and to be looking in the same direction, and to be actually aligning our policies so that there is no space between what we are doing and advocating vis-à-vis our countries and what other of our partners are doing. So working together is going to be absolutely fundamental as we move forward on this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Farid. I was actually chatting with him before, and I told him how provocative you would like to be, and he said, don't worry about that. Because he's been making interviews in the very recent past in the region, and he went even into more fundamental points than this. I think the complexity that you mentioned, fragility and resilience sits in the heart of this divide between political and development mandates. And we as banks, we don't feel that we have any political mandate. We only have development mandate. So we wait, take any country without naming. We just wait for the war or the civil war to end. And sometimes even you have to worry about the outcome of that war, because sometimes it may not go in the same direction that the donor community would like it to go. And also the other one you mentioned, the divide between humanitarian and development mandate, which is the divide between the UN system and the banks in general. And I think both points were touched on by Farid. But again, Isaac, to give you another heads up for the second round, is that the point of view of the countries that when they are going through their worst possible time and fragility, we, and particularly you, are known to have a bit more heavy-handed approach to reforms. You are telling them you have to fix your electricity sector and fuel sector, and you link that with the flow of funding. So I think if you just can think about how we can make this recipe or policy approach to resolving development issues during fragility can be justified from a development perspective. Let me move to Turkey. Turkey, of course, is a country that is generously hosting millions of refugees, mostly Syrian refugees. How is Turkey dealing with refugees and forcibly displaced people? I mean, they are called refugees, but how are you dealing with this issue, and how its impact on the country in terms of economically, socially, and so on?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I also would like to start by thanking for the invitation to be here today. Actually, before going into the Syrian issue, let me talk a little bit about Turkey's experience on building resilience. I think you already mentioned a very important concept about the timing of reforms. I think in our view, it is about constantly reforming the system, not, reforming the system when there's a crisis. But it is obviously much, harder to do. And, I have to say we have issues there as Turkey, because if you look at our economic history, especially big crisis, the banking and financial crisis at, in 2000, 2001, actually that created a very significant opportunity for us, and the incoming government at that point actually embarked on a very significant series of reforms on many areas, like on the fiscal policy, public fiscal management, on banking, which was significantly suffering, on promoting, foreign investment in the country, improving the investment climate, as well as social security reform, universal health coverage type of things. So these kind of reforms actually paid, very good results afterwards. And if you look at the economic, data regarding Turkey, the, per capita GDP actually tripled after these reforms. So we had all the, intended results, which was, significantly important for the country, obviously. But the thing is, it's also in the literature, as you all know, from like $3,000 per capita GDP, increasing it to around 10,000 is not that hard, actually. But actually taking the next step from that level to high income, meaning, more than $20,000 is not that easy, so-called the middle income trap. And actually, as a country, that's where also we are struggling. And I think the honest reason for that is the, not following through with the necessary reforms. You have to reform the system, whether or not you are having troubles or not. So I think this is quite important in terms of constantly reforming the system to build resilience. And to do that, actually, you have both economic resilience as well as political resilience. I think, in Turkish case, political side is also important to note, because if you look at the, before 2000s, actually, you would see very short-lived governments, weak governments with coalitions most of the time. We had this, long-lasting political stability after 2002, but it was still, the system was the same. So in order to reform that side as well, actually we changed the system into a presidential system, which actually forces a strong government with a strong mandate run by an executive president. And, in the recent local elections, we also saw that it promotes two sides where, one, more than 50% gets the power, gets the mandate, and it is a strong mandate. So I think this side is also important, because especially for emerging markets, unless you have a resilient political system, it is very hard to maintain economic stability, economic resilience. So from that angle, I think, keeping the reforms on a constant basis is very important. And as the Turkish government, that's what we are concentrating on. If you look at our recent past, last couple of years has been difficult for Turkey for several reasons, because of geopolitics, because of the refugee issues, because of security concerns. But now, since the political calendar is much more benign, in the upcoming period, we will be concentrating on this next level structural reforms that is necessary. Very shortly on the refugees, actually, yes, we have a significant population, not only from Syria, but from other countries as well. In total, it's close to 4 million. But we treat them as not refugees, actually. We even don't use that word. We say that, our Syrian guests, usually. And they are not actually, they are well integrated into the system, actually. It's not easy, I have to say. It's a big burden on the economy. If you look at the overall, because at the end of the day, you have to provide healthcare, you have to provide schooling, you have to provide all the services that these people need. And it has a cost attached to that. And it is, I have to say, mostly, taken by the government of Turkey. We have some, support from some countries, from some international institutions, but I have to say that is not, necessary enough. So we expect more from the international community. But the good thing is, I think they are very well, we are not having any significant social issues. I think that's important. And from a long-term perspective, actually, which these people seem to be a liability currently. But at the end of the day, if you have a long-term vision, which we do actually, once this situation in Syria is resolved, I think these people will be a huge asset for Turkey. You know, native Arab-speaking population who are, who will be taking a lot of opportunities in the region. I think is a long-term positive. So we are trying to see the positive side of it and investing in these people actually.
Excellent. Actually, since you mentioned the return of refugees, as you know, statistically speaking, UN says that on average, refugees tend to stay in other countries at least, maybe, I don't know, 7 years. Maybe this statistics is going to be much more biased or shifted with the number of crises that we're going through. I'm being reminded that we are almost running out of time, so it means that you are taking all the introduction and waiting for people to come from lunch as part of our forum. So at that, without taking that risk, let me go to the last speaker, and then we will open it up for a question before we go, if we have time, to the second round. So Dr. Mansour, thank you for hosting us. How is IDB preparing itself to better serve member countries that are fragile or affected by fragility? And mashallah, as you heard me saying, we don't have lack of those countries. Almost half of the world fragile countries are in our membership. I know that you just mentioned we are launching new policies. We are hosting this first fragility forum. But what else are we doing in that front? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Walid. And I would like to thank the audience really for joining us once again. And I also want to thank my colleagues for setting the context for the discussions. And my colleague Farid, VP Farid from the World Bank, you've done a great job in setting the context in relation to what the MDBs face, the kinds of challenges they face. For us, Islamic Development Bank, the issue of fragility and how to deal with that is a very topical one, and it's of significant importance to us because of the appreciation as a development institution that all our efforts we're investing to support the economic and social development of these countries could easily be undermined by crisis. But we also have our underlying values of solidarity, the spirit of solidarity, the spirit of leaving no one behind, the spirit of promoting peace and ensuring that there is inclusion in the society, the Islamic spirits that really are the heart of what we do. So in that context, really, it's very difficult not to be able to show any interest. We also appreciate that the majority of countries affected that are affected by conflict and fragility, or to put it another way, the proportion of countries that are affected by conflict and fragility is much higher. We have a disproportionate representation, really, a much higher representation. And the other thing that obviously we have to come to terms with is the increasing frequency and duration, even intensity of this crisis. So these are really important considerations. But as a development institution, we face major challenges because of the instruments. And if you look at historically, the focus has been more on supporting development and reconstruction. And we really have to now look at things differently because fragility and conflict has become the new normal in many countries, and it's having an impact on millions of people around the globe. And in that context, what we as the Islamic Development Bank have done, of course, earlier on we've done a lot of things, but more on an ad hoc basis, partnering with the World Bank. But recently we really realized and appreciated that we needed to give renewed emphasis and attention to this particular area. And in that context, we were able to undertake a reorganization, and we were able to reorganize our structure and create a new department, Resilience and Social Development Department. We were also able to look at ways, basically begin to look at ways of working with other partners to address this issue. And the fragility, I think the first step for us was to really develop
a framework, to have an architecture that will help us determine how best to address this issue. And we worked, our team worked hard on developing a strategy, a policy on fragility and resilience, which was approved by our board recently. And aspects of it, of course, relate to looking at this development process, or in terms of addressing these issues with a different lens, looking at it across the entire spectrum, from the period when you have to stop conflict to the period when you're expected to provide a bridge between humanitarian and development assistance, and then to the period where, as a development agency, you work to really help mobilize support for reconstruction and development, for rebuilding social infrastructure, for rehabilitating physical infrastructure, among other things, to promote growth. So this is where we are at the moment. We have gone some way in getting consensus and awareness of the issue, and we are ready to move forward, and we look at, we will continue to explore ways of partnering with other development actors. And I really want to appreciate that the World Bank has played a lead role in advancing the debate and discussions on this. I think from the seminal publication on fragility, conflict, and development, that really helped us look at things from a different lens, and I think that's important for the development community. But I think also the other role that we played is to really bring the United Nations to work closely together with the UN agencies. In the past, there was a big divide, really. You finish, we come. But now, I think with the major trip that was done by the president of the World Bank, the UN Secretary General, and I think our president was also invited to join, and the African Development Bank, really was very powerful message conveying the need for us to work together. And I think that we mustn't lose sight of that opportunity, and we'll continue to explore these areas of collaboration.
Thank you very much. Of course, we don't want to leave this room with the slightest impression that fragility and resilience is all about armed conflict. We have, of course, the other elephant in the room, which is the climate change, famine, drought, desertation, things that cause people to migrate and to leave their countries and to fall into poverty. As you know, most banks, they have like one vehicle driving the bank in the road on SDGs. And as you see, the whole theme of the annual meeting of the IDB this year is about SDGs and the road to SDGs. And unfortunately, fragility, there are lots of studies who are trying to measure how much cancellation of the achievement of SDG progress or neutralization. The fragility vehicle in the countries is driving us in the opposite direction. And tomorrow, I think we're going to have a forum on the voluntary national reviews. It's a technical term in SDGs, just to review how countries and progress. And I'm sure they will touch on some of the impediments for achieving SDGs. It's not enough just to progress without paying attention to these derailments in the countries, and which we sometimes tend to forget about. I know that in some forums you ask for questions. I see people already raising their hand before we finish. We have 10 minutes, and I had 2 quick points to come back to the panel, but maybe we should give a chance to the floor, and then if we have time, I will come back, one for the minister and one for Farid. Yes, do you have microphones here? Are there microphones for questions? Yeah, it's coming, but slowly. So please be as quick. Just help us because of the time. We have less than 10 minutes. Over here. Here. Abdi, run.
First row.
There, first row. Second. Yes, go ahead. It's open.
Ali Al-Hakami, Secretary General, King Abdullah International Humanitarian Foundation. I agree with Mr. Farid that resilience is to rebound stronger and to not to go back to the initial point. But what I see from our respected panel is restricting the concept of resilience to economic and political resilience. It's more than that. It's wide-ranging. I think the most important aspect that we are missing in resilience is the psychological and social aspect. Building the strength, the personal strength, the psychological strength of the societies to be able to cope with issues. It's not only economic issue or political issue, but it is relates to social services, to psychological first aid, to education. So I would like in the future, when discussing this, I think I would love to see social scientists or people who are really specialists in resilience from that angle to be included. Otherwise, we may help initially in relieving some instant problems or issues, but we will not deal with the core issues. If you go to the core matter, you will find that the personal strength of individuals have been really hit by those disasters, and we have to rebuild it. And also we have to prevent that from occurring again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with you. We, as I said in my introduction, we said this is a huge topic, and we don't claim to cover even 10% of it. Plus, there are other sessions in the forum, which we're trying to make time for them to come. But I agree with you, and MDBs, particularly MDBs, never claim that we can cover, especially those sensitive areas like psychological and social aspects, which reminds me of the adaptation and mitigation. How do you prepare people and deal with people who have been through fragility? It's extremely important. Other questions? Okay, one more, maybe this side is a bit more active. Okay, let's go with the same side.
Thank you. Mohammed Amrani from FAO. Thank you for all the presentation. I think the resilience for development is an affair of all stakeholders, the population, the country, government, as well as international organizations and donors. So my question will be direct for the two representatives of World Bank and IDB. What is the paradigm shift that should be taken off in the future on the programs and projects that the financial institutions are proposing to the countries to enhance resilience in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very easy question. Farid and Mansour, very quickly, please. Paradigm shifts.
Yes. Well, a couple of words, and I'll use my, time is running out, so I'll use my time to embrace two issues. One, the issue that you mentioned earlier. Why are you pushing some countries to move into, sometimes painful reforms when they are fragile? Actually, because they haven't gone through those reforms for years, they've made themselves fragile. You mentioned Lebanon, but I can mention tons of countries. The electricity sector in Lebanon has nothing to do with the refugee crisis. It's been there forever. And it is draining the budget of the country. And it is making actually the country become even more vulnerable to any type of shock. So for me, there is absolutely no discrepancy between pushing an agenda that is a right agenda, a reform agenda, whether it is in an environment that is kind of stable, or in an environment where things may not be, totally aligned. So we need to make sure that we don't fall, into the trap of let things stay the way they are because they are dealing with something else. We can manage. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, as they say. The other issue, two questions, absolutely fundamental. One is the issue of reconstruction and recovery is very easy if it is just to rebuild a house and rebuild a bridge. I mean, very easy. Everything is relative, but it is easy. What is really important is to rebuild, resaw the social fabric. We saw it in Iraq, for instance. When we were, and I was not very long ago in Mosul, you go there and see, we were rebuilding the bridge that would bring the two parts of the city together. Frankly, it is tough, it is complicated, but at the end of the day, it's doable. But what is really complicated is to make sure that those people who, for whatever reason, found themselves either under or with Daesh when Daesh was coming down, you need to look at that, look at the reasons why that happened. Why was the place so vulnerable, so easy to absorb by these people who came in I remember I was there. In less than 72 hours, they went from Mosul all the way to close to Baghdad. We had to evacuate our people, and I was in Baghdad at the time. So what I'm saying is that something must have happened there, and that something needs to be looked at very carefully, and you're absolutely right. It's not just rebuilding, it is resewing, the fabric of the societies. And the last point relates to what our colleague from FAO mentioned, and actually it's very much linked. Dealing with resilience will have a lot to do with the ownership of the people we are working on and we are working with. So we cannot just come and kind of a top-down approach and think that we have all the solutions. We need, one, to partner with you, because in many places we are not as much in the field as the UN, one. And second, make sure that we embrace in our engagement the people who are supposed to be, quote unquote, benefiting from our engagement. So the times of, whether the bank or anybody else coming and saying this is the way to go, these times are long gone. We really need to make sure that we are working together.
Thank you, Farid. The question was addressed to both MDBs. Dr. Mansour, do you want to add something? I agree with Farid.
I can add a few things, I hope. Basically, I agree that we need to do things differently, and with a focus on fragility, resilience, and conflict. And that, in essence, means that this has to be mainstreamed in our work in this entire cycle, from member country partnership strategy to the design of programs and projects and to their implementation. And in this regard, I agree also that we need to have country ownership, but we also need to be more flexible and agile, and basically to be able to respond to a very complex situation. Probably the kinds of interventions that we have to do will also be we need to give more emphasis, rebalance our interventions from the heavy infrastructure to the soft infrastructure side. And the human capital development project of the World Bank provides a useful entry point for this reorientation. But I think it's also important, given the intensity of resources required to address these issues, that we have to really look at creative ways of mobilizing and leveraging additional resources from other partners through different arrangements. We are pursuing a couple of them, including crowdfunding strategies, including a facility, fragility financing facility that will be innovative and flexible in addressing these needs. And the last point, of course, is the partnership that has to be built with all the key stakeholders. And I think really I want to emphasize that we also need to focus on the private sector. How can we get the private sector involved in supporting the building of resilience in addressing fragility? And that's a big challenge that we all need to grapple with, find a way of addressing it.
Thank you very much. We will take one last question, but before that, I promise to come back to the other two speakers. Your Excellency, Minister of Finance, we are so proud of the progress that Somalia has been able to achieve. We're a long-term partner. We look forward to be with you next week in the meeting with IMF. But can you tell us, so that people can leave this room with some hope, what is the timeline? What is the ambition that Somalia has to end this current state? As you said, you went from failed state to fragile state, now recovering state. You were telling us earlier about a program that you agreed to come back to full strength and be able to. You also mentioned that you are now already able to raise internal revenue to cover the operating costs of the government, which is quite remarkable for Somalia. So very quickly, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. Two issues. One, I think given all the problems that Somalia had, if Somalia is still here and still kicking, I think there is hope in the collaboration of the international community with countries, especially the banks and the other bilaterals and the UN and everybody else. So we really are beneficiaries of those. That's why we are still here. I would however, advise the banks, IFIs. We are on the other side of the table, and we evaluate you on our own glasses, and maybe different from your own. I would really suggest that when you revise your policies and when you develop new policies, that you avoid that one size fits all. Because you have challenges, enormous challenges, coming from so many angles and so many. Our societies are all different. The challenges are different, and where they emanate are different. So when you are now developing your fragility, think about, take into account the experience that we had recently. And I think that will be very helpful. For example, we are now going through the HIPIC, and the HIPIC initiative was put in place in 1990s. So Somalia presents, I think, every unique situation is unique, presenting a new unique situation. It is better that you revise and regulate and adjust them, instead of just looking at the book and saying, Somalia, you have a loan, so as long as we have a loan, pay it and then come back to us. Some institutions are like that. Others are not. Because you give loans, you give resources to other countries, and if they don't pay, you have your own rules to stop giving loans. But then how do these countries survive? How do they survive? I think banks should have other windows that can assist these countries get out of the problem beyond the humanitarian. You know, a disaster, you have humanitarian something, but there has to be a way. There are some issues. Now, on Somalia issue, on our side, we really are trying our best to do our own thing, just like any other country. We want to be able to pay the debt. It is not possible because it's too huge, but we don't want to get into another debt. Number one. Number two, we want to be able very soon to be able to cover the cost of running the government, operating cost of the government. We want to, we don't want to get into services and activities for which we have no resources of our own. In fact, I want to say that the SMB programs, the SMB program is very stringent, but we find them very useful. They are asking us to do things that we have not done for a long time, but these are all good. They are difficult, but they are good. Don't get into arrears because you cannot pay. Good. Register everybody, and everybody that works for you, pay them. It's good. If you pay them, let that money go to his account, not some intermediary guy. Very good. If you have bad contracts, international contracts that the government signed when you were very weak, renegotiate. It's very good. Manage your resources better. Very good. Very hard, but it's very good. The major issues for us is the one that says don't employ anybody because you have no money. So what do we do with all these youth? And Somalia is one of the youngest populations, 75% younger than 30 years old. What do we do with them? Enormous energy that can be turned into, that can be explosive. But if you use them, it becomes very, very useful. So these are some of the things that I think international community, and particularly the IFIs, should. That's not all the case in many cases.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I know this is going to be a long topic of discussion next week in Washington. So, is there any last question before I give the floor to Kemal Bey for last word? Yes, there's one at the very back. In the middle here, back, in the last row.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you so much for the sessions, for the conference, and for everything. So I only have one question.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, of course.
Just your name, where you come from.
All right. So I really want to ask you one question. Don't you think, sir, that in... Yeah, all right. So I couldn't hear you. So I'm on the second year at the National School of Business and Management. So I really want to ask you one question, sir. Don't you think that in the way of rescuing some countries or helping some countries getting out of some shock consequences, don't you think that we are leading some others like to the biggest shock ever? Because actually this is what I can notice from everything now, from the economy, from the social part, from everything. Don't you think that through like the fact of helping some countries, of developing, of getting out of some, as I said, some shock consequences, that we are leading some others to some other shocks? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We'll try to take up this. Anybody picked the question on the... Yeah, it was difficult to hear, But maybe, do you want to repeat that question briefly in Arabic or French? Because unless we have to maybe put these things, because there was a lot of echo. تتكلم عربي؟ تتكلم عربي؟ طب أطلب منك بس تعيد السؤال باختصار، إما بالعربي أو بالإنجليزي، خلينا نسمعه لأن ما كان واضح الصوت.
I think I can repeat it just in English. So if it is possible. All right. So my question was, don't you think, sir, that in the way of rescuing some countries, of getting out of a shock consequences, we are leading some others to another big shock again?
So, paying attention to short-term consequences of fragility, and that coming at the expense of long-term impact on other countries. So probably the issue of the neighboring countries. So maybe this is an opportunity to come back to Turkey. As I said, Turkey is not a fragile country by itself, but you are dealing with the impact of fragility of a neighboring country. And you already said that you are not getting as much international support as you want because dealing with refugees is a global issue that is not only the responsibility. I know you are doing it from a humanitarian and your commitment to world peace and so on. But what do you see a combination in terms of taking the short-term versus long-term approach to dealing with fragility? Are you just managing Syrian refugees just to take them back like in a very short period of time, or you're preparing yourself for a longer term?
I think actually that's a very good point. I think, there is no short-term solution to this anyway, because, the situation in Syria isn't being solved for a long time now, and I don't really know when the situation will be solved anyway. So, inshallah soon, but, you have to be prepared for the worst. And actually, if you talk to some of those people that have been in Turkey like 4 or 5, even more years now, probably some of them, even the conflict resolved, probably won't go back, because probably there is nothing to go back for some of them at least. So you have to have a long-term view, but obviously it doesn't mean that you cannot deal with the short-term issues like putting, for example, just a important number, just to show you the sheer size of the problem. There are 900,000 school-age kids, just Syrian kids in Turkey. So how can you overlook their education? It's because if you cannot provide the necessary education, then these are probably will be very vulnerable when they reach certain ages. So you have to deal with both, the current issue and obviously plan for the future as well. I think it has to go hand in hand.
Okay. Thank you very much. I know that organizers are going to beat me up, but we have consumed the time plus 10 minutes, but that's fair because we started 10 minutes late. So please help me thank the panelists for their points of view and for their discussion and enlargement of us.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful discussion. So, before we move into the next session, we would like to call on participants that we have active social media accounts. So we would like you to utilize the opportunity, please, to promote the event. The handles are at ISDB_group, and there another one called at IDB spokesperson. You can sign union and has worked in several countries in the region. He has also a global outreach and has discussed this issue of resilience at several fora. I have the honor to invite my brother and our spokesperson, advisor to the President on Global Advocacy, Dr. Abdul Hakim Al-Wair. Can we give him a warm welcome, please? As he comes onto the stage, he would be the one to provide the keynote remark and then invite the moderators for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Jamil. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon to everyone. I've just been told by the organizers that they have only provided seats for the number of the speakers. and they decided to test my resilience and asked me to stay standing for the session as there is no seat. We'll see how that works. But thank you very much for staying in. And well, we've seen a very provocative discussions. Definitely it's at a high policy level. I've seen excellencies, the ministers, VPs from World Bank, ISDB, representatives of the Turkish authorities, and how the issues of fragility against resilience are addressed at high policy level. I just picked some few words that I would like to float for my team here that will join me in a minute to consider while we're addressing more technical level at what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, and what are the lessons learned that we can take from. I picked resilience against fragility. Now these, as we have just seen, they're two different things. It's actually resilience addressing fragility. So we wanted to think about that. But also during the debate and some of the provocative discussions, as alluded to development vis-a-vis humanitarian assistance. And we've seen now development institutions as well as the UN institutions is becoming more and more difficult for them to draw a line between where do we allocate humanitarian assistance or development assistance. Can development assistance be a beneficiary to address fragility and resilience? So that is a challenge also once we talk about opportunities and challenges that we need to address. But more seriously, I've picked from the discussions when we look at new trends on globalization, modernization. It is the development communities that is pushing communities to go on globalization, modernization, which is actually, in many cases, destroys, if not eliminates, what we call the social fabrics. Now, the social fabrics is, I'm talking from our perspective as Islamic Development Bank. Going back to our Islamic roots, it is that social solidarity that creates what we call natural resilience. How did the ancestors manage to live and survive more serious crises than what we face today? It is because of the solidarity that was established through that social fabrics. And again, we come under our development when we do not consider the local, what we call background and even the religious faiths, but more the social fabrics. And we try to introduce some new modalities under globalization, modernization, and urbanization, which basically does lead to dismantling of that structure. And when we hit by a crisis, we start asking, where is the solidarity? Of course, we've already done away with it, and we can't claim that we'd have a solidarity to keep us going. ISDB is established on the basis of solidarity. It is a South-South cooperation institution that is among the Global South member countries to support each other, and the basis of the whole OIC coming together is the solidarity aspect, which is, I see, at least from my understanding as a layman on the issue of building resilience as a strong format of building resilience. If we have solidarity among the member countries of the countries that are hit today by crisis, we wouldn't have the situations that we have today. So with that, I'll leave those questions for the team or the panel we're expecting to join us here to hopefully give some answers to. I want to call them in the order that I would like them also to be seated, so I hope the organizers are following this. I relied very much on our system Morouge to make this organization in the logical structure, but even if that's not, then I will be able to still call them on the order. So Mr. Hugh Mackelman from the OECD, he is with us here today, and if you can join us here, please. Hughes has been the Crisis and Fragility Policy Advisor at the Organization of the Economic Cooperation and Development, and he has worked very heavily on developing a recent report from OECD on fragility and resilience. We'll hear more from Hugh in due course. As well as I would like to call Abdi. Abdi Abdullah is our manager for the human development and also in charge of the NGOs division at the Resilience and Social Development Department. Consultant, Nate has been the program director for Fund for Resilience, but he is currently working as a consultant developing the IsDB report on resilience and fragility. And then we have Dr. Kenan Bagchi. He is from CISRIC, our OIC institution on statistics, research, and training, based in Ankara, covering the OIC member countries. And last but not least, we have Ms. Heik Rodriguez. She is from the EIB, and she is the head of the institutional and policy affairs of the European Union neighboring regions, neighboring countries from the European Investment Bank. So thank you very much. Can you please welcome all the speakers in the panels? Thank you. I think based on looking at what are we expecting and anticipating from each speaker representing each institution, we wanted to try and start from going into a global picture on what resilience and fragility looks like more globally. And that's where we start with the OECD. Look at what OECD sees the situation today and how are the major aspects are identified or defined and monitored. And we'll go on as we hear the speakers zoom in into a more regional, but we say non-OIC region situation before we move into the specifics to the OIC member countries. So with that, I would like to call upon you to take on the floor and share with us the status of fragility and resilience as seen by OECD. You have the floor.
Many thanks, and thank you for having me here this afternoon. I think from what we've heard from the first session this morning, probably the overarching thing that I've taken away from that is that resilience is complex. So I'm going to take a little bit of time just trying to unpick that and provide some perspectives from the OECD in terms of what we understand about fragility. It's complex, but it's important. We've heard that it crosses borders, it drives famine, it creates terror, it drives pandemics, conflict, and displacement. And what I would say is that all countries, we've heard about the countries from the Islamic Development Bank, but all countries are fragile to a certain extent. I mean, I'm from the UK. The UK is experiencing significant political fragility at the moment. I live in Paris, and Paris most weekends now is on fire. But some countries are more resilient to fragility than others. So the OECD has been looking at different dimensions that drive fragility, and you'll see on the screen here the fragility framework. And the 5 dimensions that we think are particularly important in terms of understanding fragility are political, societal, economic, environment, and security dimensions of fragility. And what you'll see when you look at this wheel here, I don't know how well you can see it up on the screen, is that there is significant variation between the different contexts. You'll see that some are very fragile in terms of the political dimension, some are very fragile in terms of the environmental dimension. So it looks very different in different places, depending on these dimensions of fragility. What we do know, however, is that they're connected. There's no point in addressing fragility in silos, is that when there is fragility in one dimension, it has an impact on fragility in another dimension. We need to move towards a multi-dimensional approach to fragility, and we need to start to address it in terms of more systems thinking, if you like. So some of the things that we know about countries that are fragile. We know that it's a problem, and it's a problem that's getting worse. At the moment, there are 1.8 billion of the extreme poor who live in fragile contexts, but by 2030, that's likely to rise to 2.3 billion people, so 80% of the world's extreme poor will live in fragile contexts. It's very geographically uneven. You'll see there that In sub-Saharan Africa, there are 35 fragile situations. In the MENA region, 9, Latin America, 4. So it's very unevenly spread geographically. And it also disproportionately affects young people. And we see that in fragile countries is that there are more young people. The median age is 20 in fragile countries as opposed to in non-fragile situations, or less fragile situations, I should say. We also too know that actually there's not a linear relationship between fragility and poverty. 30 of the 58 countries that are on the fragility spectrum, if you like, are not poor countries, they're middle-income countries. So it's not the case that poor countries are fragile countries. There's not a linear relationship between these two dimensions, if you like. Nor does it necessarily relate to conflict. Only 9 of the countries. We also know that the majority of the countries on the fragility spectrum are not democracies. So there is a link there between governance and fragility that's very important as well. When we look at, what I said before is that 31 are classified as authoritarian regimes. Many are affected by terrorism, but only 9 are affected by conflict. In terms of some of the key trends that we think that we need to focus on to address fragility going forward, I won't go through all of them, but we heard today is that the geopolitical aspects of fragility are very important. Is that we look at the MENA region, for instance, we look at sub-Saharan African, and fragility crosses borders, so we need to be aware of the geopolitical context in which fragility happens. We heard about social contracts. Social contracts are very important, building social contracts, ensuring that development is inclusive, that societies are inclusive, is a very important aspect of addressing fragility. We can't just focus at the national level. We know that if we only focus at the national level, that this doesn't work. So we also need to think about what we're doing to address fragility at sub-national levels. Cities can be fragile in an overall quite stable national context. So we need to think about how do we reach those sub-national dimensions of fragility. Gender is important. When you look at the fragilities list, is that those countries that are most fragile are also the countries that have most unequal gender relations. So there's a correlation between gender equality and fragility. Climate also, and illicit financial flows. So I can see I'm starting to get looked at in terms of time. So what are we doing about this? We need to address it. We're not going to meet our commitments around the SDGs unless we tackle fragility. But, and I think we heard it from colleagues before, we need to do it together. And this is a key point. We can't keep doing it as IsDB, as the World Bank, as OECD member states. We need to do it together. There needs to be greater coherence between governments, between bilateral actors, the OECD DAC members, the multilateral system, so development banks and the UN, and civil society. We also need to have more complementarity, and we heard it before, between humanitarian development and peace actors, and this is really important. And for you as the IDB, this is important, and for us as the OECD, it's important. The UN system delivers 80% of humanitarian assistance, but most of the ODA, the development assistance that goes on development, actually goes through bilateral channels. 77% of development in fragile states is through bilateral channels. So we need to work more closely between the banks, between the UN system, and between the bilateral actors and national governments who really need to take charge of this themselves. Otherwise, we're not going to meet our commitments around the SDGs. I'm going to finally leave you with what we're doing specifically at the OECD. So OECD DAC members spend $148 billion a year on development assistance. So it's a big pot of money, and we need to get it right as the OECD to ensure that that aid, that taxpayer money, is actually spent effectively. So just at the end of February, we developed a new legal instrument for OECD DAC members called the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus Recommendation. And this is quite an important step, and it's a step change for our members, if you like. It's only the 7th legal instrument that they've signed, that they've developed and approved in 60 years. So they don't do this very often. So it really indicates a step change in terms of bilateral actors' engagement in addressing fragility. It looks at a number of principles that I won't go through now, but basically looks at how we work together with each other around strengthening coordination, around strengthening programming, and strengthening financing. Now, all 30 DAC members have now signed up to this normative framework, to this legal instrument, and we're now looking at how we reach out to the other actors, to development banks, to the UN.
Move on to the sub-regional level, and we have Haig Rotergs, and she's working for the European Investment Bank. We know the European Investment Bank serves the European Union, but also the neighboring region. Most of the neighboring region of Europe is actually members of the IDB and the OIC family, but also there is Eastern Europe and other regions that would like to see if we can drive some lessons and learn on certain fragility and resilience aspects. So, Haig, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this very kind invitation to give me the floor here to present to you in a regional, let's say, sub-zoom to our Economic Resilience Initiative, which was launched in 2016 and is supposed to run until 2020, and covering from a geographic coverage the Western Balkans as well as the southern neighborhood, so the MENA region, which was the region identified as being mostly hit by the refugee crisis, which started in 2015. The idea of this Economic Resilience Initiative was to develop a program with the instruments we have at hand and which we develop further to make a contribution to indeed increase the economic resilience of these fragile countries. The idea was really to have an initiative that supports economic growth and stimulates employment and reduces the vulnerability of the countries affected, and by focusing, of course, on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals in total. So to take a long-term perspective on economic resilience of these regions. The idea was also to accelerate investment. These are regions where we are normally also active for many, many years, but to really stimulate growth and employment by increasing our investment and by mobilizing additional investment of some 15 billion in these regions. The focus on the initiative is both public sector as well as private sector, because we considered both parts are important in order to reduce vulnerability and help these countries to absorb better shocks as of now as well as in the future. Areas of interventions are private sector development and job creation, so very much also focusing on micro as well as SME development, but also strategic infrastructure and transport, energy and climate change as being a long-term challenge for a lot of these countries, and focusing a lot on vital social infrastructure. So really looking into, and we have been discussing this already this morning in the Youth Forum, education as well as social cohesion. And then also looking at the livelihood really of the local population. So there is a lot of investment in the area of water and sanitation. Now, in what sense is the initiative different to what we do normally? So that it is not just more of the same of what we do already, but really taking a different and adaptive approach in order to design the projects in the way that we increase the impact on economic resilience for local populations. And there I think a very important angle is what was mentioned also by Vice President Farid earlier from the World Bank, is that we create the local conditions to enable local populations in a broad sense, not only refugee communities, but also local populations in order to enhance their economic empowerment, including specific groups like youth and women, but also to create in general the conditions for stimulating growth in the countries and enhancing local reforms by that. And so projects are, as I mentioned, in the area of critical infrastructure investment, where we mobilize also really concessional financing conditions. So in order to enable also local economies to take on board this extra burden in terms of vital infrastructure. Then we are combining all our interventions with a lot of capacity building measures in order to prepare the investments as well as to help them implementing, but also creating long-term capacity in either public utilities as well as in the financial sector, so the financial intermediaries we are working with, but also enabling really the final beneficiaries, so the entrepreneurs, for example, to materialize their investments. And another angle of this initiative is also that we are taking measures in order to be able to take a higher risk also in the investments we are engaging in. And that means that we are investing probably in a riskier part of a financing package, so in order to crowd in other investors to join us, that we are looking into providing funding for riskier counterparts than we would do normally, that we are including a component which we define as impact financing, where we are taking a higher level of risk in order to achieve a higher development impact. So really reaching out to segments where we have not been able to provide funding before. And also to provide longer maturities in order to create a better debt sustainability, be it on the public sector side as well as on the private sector side. If we now go to my last slide, we can provide you with a snapshot on the delivery, actually. Wait a minute. Okay, there it is. Okay, on the delivery. So we are now two-thirds, well, almost three-quarters down the road in terms of approvals of projects. They are well spread among the countries we are operating in. We are, of course, in the MENA region, you would find a lot of focus being put on countries like Lebanon and Jordan, who are really facing a particular challenge these days with a very high level of refugee communities, and also being quite under pressure in terms of debt sustainability on the public sector side. So that is definitely a focus of our work. And then, as you see, in terms of what I mentioned earlier, in order to stimulate employment, a very strong focus on providing access to finance in a very inclusive measure for micro as well as small and medium enterprises in the countries we are operating in. And that also partially in local currency. We have programs, for example, in Jordan and in the area of microfinance, which are developing also access to finance for female refugees. So in order to incorporate them, allow them to have an economic community, so to look after themselves and being less of a burden to the public sector. So these are elements we are trying to implement in this inclusive, coherent initiative, where we are working with a lot of partners, be it other MDBs like Islamic Development Bank, but also a lot of technical partners we are working with, like UNDP or so to really be very inclusive and as comprehensive in our approach as we can be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sheikh. It's clear that the EIB gets involved into rebuilding and reconstructing fragile states in the region, and we've seen how much you've allocated and how much you've gone so far in implementing that particular allocation. Well, one of the areas that we would like, once you come back later on, to highlight is how are these initiatives or priorities are identified. Do they come on ad hoc? Is it from the other development community available on the ground? Is it the political discussions that drives it and identifies this is the priorities and this is so? That is something that addresses a lot of questions, especially on reconstructing countries that have gone through fragile situations, whether that really addresses the local community's needs, or is it something that we as international community impose upon them without really addressing their needs. So we want to see how that works. But let me move on more specific to the OIC region, inviting Dr. Kenan Bakshi, who is the acting director for Economic and Social Research Department at the Statistical, Economic, and Social Research and Training Center, SESRIC, based in Ankara. SESRIC is an OIC institution, very well known, that carries a lot of our studies. I recall one of the very early studies we did on resilience was managing disasters in OIC member countries, which we did at the ISDB some 3 or 4 years ago together with SESRIC. It was the first that really identifies the capacity of resilience of OIC member countries. It was first launched and presented at the Sendai UN Conference on Disaster Risk in Japan. So over to you, Kenan, and let us see what SESRIC tells us about the situation and the status within OIC member countries. Thank you.
Thank you for this nice introduction. Actually, as SESRIC is a research center, we are not able to provide or mobilize financial resources as other multilateral development institutions do, but we contribute to the accumulation of knowledge, and we do intensive research over the last several years on the humanitarian challenges that are being faced in the OIC countries. We did we prepared a couple of reports, and we came up some important findings and some policy recommendations. What I will present today is what are the main humanitarian challenges in OIC countries and how they are affecting the communities and what are the potential remedies. So when we talk about humanitarian crisis, we just consider conflicts and natural disasters as the main two drivers of humanitarian challenges. So when we look at the figures on the number of conflicts in OIC countries, there is a steady increase over the years, particularly after 2003, where the US invasion of Iraq took place. Over the period of 15 years, number of conflicts in OIC countries have been constantly increased, and it reached 32 in 2015, which is the highest level. We observe very slight decrease over the last 2 years, but still OIC countries have been accounting more than 60% of all conflicts in the world. They were mostly internal conflicts, where state had some conflicts with some opposition parties. But when it comes to 2017, most of the conflicts are internationalized conflicts. What does it mean? It doesn't mean there's a conflict between different states or multiple states. It's a conflict, again, internal conflict, but with interference, with participation of international powers. So OIC countries have become a battleground for international powers over the years, especially after 2011. Another dimension of humanitarian crisis is, of course, natural disasters. In this perspective, OIC countries are not that much vulnerable when we look at the figures. Number of occurrences around 20–25%, and people affected from natural disasters around 10% of the global figures. But what from OIC countries, indicating that, in fact, OIC is also very vulnerable to natural disasters. The same applies in the conflicts. Most of the fatalities in conflicts have been taking place in OIC countries. Just more than half of them are in the MENA region. As a direct outcome of these conflicts and natural disasters, we are observing a huge dramatic increase in global displacement. Just over the last 1.5 years, more than 1.4 million additional refugees have been recorded in OIC countries. Today, almost 13 million refugees OIC countries produced. And these are people that moved across the borders. There are also more than 20 million people who displaced within their countries. And these all poses great challenges for the OIC countries. So when we look at the main factors that drive the displacement, in fact, globally, around 70% of new displacement takes place or happens because of natural disasters, but it is not the case in OIC countries. Still, in OIC countries, natural disasters account slightly greater number of displacement, but most of the conflict-driven displacement in the world happens in OIC countries. So this is a very important fact that we have to consider. Another major issue with regards to refugees is that although OIC countries are producing a major share of the refugees in the world, they in fact hosting more refugees than they're producing, which in fact puts further pressure on the host communities in terms of limited infrastructure and services in those countries. This is another challenge. Another implication of these political instabilities and conflicts is the rise of terrorism. As you see, over the years, the number of the share of OIC countries into global terrorism has been increased very rapidly and reached up to 77% some years back. Now it decreased around 68%, but still most of the terrorism happens in OIC countries. What does it mean? It means instability, both in political terms, in economic terms. If there are such high number of terrorism, people or investors will not come to that country to invest. This is a great implication. So what we know in the economic front is most of these affected countries suffer from huge economic losses. In some countries, the economic cost of violations are more than 50 or 60%. So I'm very quickly going through the slides. They will be probably available on internet. But what are the major causes of the fragilities? Very quickly, I am summarizing. Actually, there are four main dimensions. One is economic and structural factors, which includes poverty, income disparity, and demographic pressures. There are also political and institutional factors, which also creates additional fragility in OIC countries, which includes poor governance, weak institutions, and the lack of participation to decision making. The third dimension is social and environmental factors. Here again, we have unequal access to services, social exclusion, and climate change, and many other factors. So I have to be quick. And the fourth dimension where we have fragilities are the regional and international factors. Here we observe large price fluctuation or price speculations in commodity prices, which affect some countries which are heavily reliant on a certain set of goods, which affects their revenues and spending behaviors. Also, lack of regional cooperation within the OIC just reduces the likelihood of strengthening resilience at regional level. So all these issues led us to come up with some recommendations which we may discuss in the second round, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kenan. That was a clear highlight of what the CISRIC, on behalf of the OIC family, sees the status of fragility and resilience. And hopefully that would provide also the OIC policymakers and decision makers on clear recommendations on how they proceed forward. Zooming into the ISDB, which is the development institution of the OIC family, we've heard Abdi, the Vice President Mansour Mukhtar, in the earlier session talking about what did ISDB do in the past to address fragility and resilience, setting up a department. Sister May is here with us. We'll hear from her later. But then we want to hear from you more on what does ISDB engagement into the resilience and fragility aspect is now, and where are we heading? What exactly are we trying to do? How do we match that with our normal operations for development and normal financing packages? So over to you, Abdi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Wa'ir. And having listened the presentations that have been made, the picture is quite gloomy and scary. If you look at it from IDB member country challenge, 58 of the countries that are considered fragile by OECD, 29 of them are IDB member countries. 29 out of 57 IDB member countries are either fragile or in conflict-affected situation. If you look at the challenge that's facing when it comes to forced displacement, some of you have mentioned that 70% of the global refugees are hosted in IDB member countries. Only 5 countries are producing the largest refugees globally, and they happen to be IDB member countries. As an IDB, we cannot escape from these challenges. However, I can tell you this challenge requires not only addressing it, but also introducing innovative ways and transformative ways to address the challenge. So what we have done was that we first look at what, as an IDB, what we can do. What are the experience, best practices, lessons learned, and capacity of the bank to address this challenge. We have done an extensive studies where we have made a significant number of consultations with member countries that are facing this challenge, those who are going through this difficult time, and those also have been affected by the conflict happening in their neighboring countries. So we came out an IDB fragility and resilience policy, which looks at not only understanding the fragility drivers and issues itself, but finding solutions that are really addressing the drivers. So if you look at our policy, we as a development bank, we tend to be shy away addressing the issues of linking humanitarian and development. Most of the MDBs focus on developments, wait until the situation normalizes, and then come into and finance and support development projects. However, the current situation cannot allow that. We need to go and work development and humanitarian hand in hand. So this policy focuses more on resilience building, issues that addresses the drivers of fragility. So the first focus of the policy is to invest in prevention. Often when we carry out this analysis, and most of also the reports of my colleagues emphasize that investing early on not only saves lives, but also assets and avoids huge problems that we cannot solve. So if we invest in prevention, understand the drivers of fragility, and provide tailored solutions that are addressing issues like growth and equity, financial inclusions, building market resilience. Often these fragile countries, we underestimate, they have a vibrant and a strong private sector that, if financed and supported, can create jobs for youth that are unemployed and increase the pressure and risks on those countries. So one of our aim is to promote inclusive development that creates jobs for the youth and young people. Second aspect also we are looking at is managing the transition, relief, and development. This is critical. We cannot separate humanitarian and development. We cannot wait conflicts to finish and then come back and start the development interventions. That has been proven wrong, and it has not yielded any results. I can give you an example. A young child who has been 5 years old when the Syrian conflict started, today that child is around 11 or 12 years. If we don't provide education early on, if we don't support and provide health services, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to support the development of that child. So it's very critical that we, while we are saving lives, also ensuring that we think about long-term development interventions. So here what we are calling programs and projects that are bridging the gap between humanitarian and development. And in line with that also, we are supporting, often we only focus countries that are really experiencing conflict or fragility itself. But there are a number of countries, as my previous panel members have mentioned, that do not have conflicts, but they have some sort of spillover effects, large number of refugees and forced displacements. Countries like Jordan, Turkey, who are not able to cope with the pressure of those refugees. How could we help them? So what we are proposing here is just not only supporting those countries, but also changing the narrative that in the sense that refugees can be considered as an opportunity for the hosting countries through the private sector development, through SMEs, integrating and allowing hosting communities to benefit from the refugees. The third important pillar that we are focusing is supporting recovery and resilience. There are a large number of countries that are coming out of conflicts. As His Excellency, the Minister of Finance of Somalia, have mentioned that recovery is very critical. Investing in reconstruction and recovery is very critical, so that we will not allow countries to go back to conflict, and the conflict will not relapse again. So we are investing all sorts of capitals, starting from human, social, financial, and physical capital, ensuring that young people who have been affected by the conflict have better opportunities, and they have more to gain to have peace than to join the rebel groups. And that's the only way we can do that is if we invest in human capital and provide more resources and opportunities so that they will be able to better integrate in the society and will be considered as the future of their countries. And fourthly, and more importantly, is issue of financing. Without having something in the boat, it will be very difficult to achieve all these challenges. And it's crystal clear that classical ways of doing things, our traditional approach, waiting countries to come and submit their official requests, is no longer supporting those countries. Those countries require innovative ways, innovative financing, transformative financing, financing that will allow them to support the development programs and projects that they want to create jobs for the young people and the youth. So what we are here proposing is fragility financing facility, which does not only call using grants and quick dispersing financing, but also looking at innovative financing like development impact certificates and how we can engage with non-traditional partners like philanthropists, foundations, and those who are interested in financing social aspects of development. This is really critical. It's a new market that we have not tried before, and the only way we can do is if the sovereign financing is not working, is to look at how we can crowdly engage with other actors, the private sector, the social entrepreneurs, and ensuring that no one is left behind when it comes to addressing the issues of fragility. And in the long run, IDB is trying to engage in the analytical part, understanding the fragility itself, and that's why the bank is producing its first resilience report, which does not only look at the issue and drivers of fragility, as my many colleagues have mentioned. OECD has written volumes of reports on fragility, but we are looking at things that are really working. If you look at Yemen, there are successful case studies given that the challenges the country is facing.
I want to stop you here. I'll come back to you.
Let me finish that point.
Okay.
I think the report, which will be highlighting what works on the ground and what can be replicated to other countries.
Clear. Well, thank you very much. I think it's clear that the ISDB is heavily or getting heavily engaged into the resilience and conflict issues and trying to address fragility through building resilience. One question that remains mainly to possibly OECD, EIB, and yourself later is how do these financial development institutions work together in addressing these challenges. It doesn't help very much these countries with these isolated or maybe some non-coordinated efforts that come from different institutions. So this is the situation that require more and more coordination. And I'll list after the last speaker some examples where we have been involved, and it's really worrying that we don't hear about them. I was waiting to hear about them on the first session. I didn't hear about them yet in this session, so it's something that we need to address as well. Let me call Mr. Nate Haken, who is currently our consultant at the Islamic Development Bank on developing the ISDB Resilience Report. I have a comment on the title of the report. This is from an English perspective, but also comes back from a bit selfish. I'm chairing a task force at the Islamic Development Bank on business continuity management for the institution. And looking at other institutions, we decided to call it Institutional Resilience Framework. And this is addressing resilience as an institution, not so much in the member countries. Calling the report ISDB Resilience Report, it looks like an institutional resilience report. So I would rather call it resilience status in OIC or IDB member countries, ISDB. So the member country's name has to appear somewhere in the report to reflect it is for member countries, not for the institution. Sorry, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you today. I've very much enjoyed this opportunity to work on this report with my ISDB colleagues. It's been a very enlightening process for me. And the data and analysis from CESRIC is absolutely invaluable. So I just want to give them a shout out. They're doing some amazing research, and I think that we would all find it useful in our various areas of work. Abdi started off by saying that the situation seems gloomy. He said that the situation may even seem scary. And if you just look at the data on fragility, that may be the case. However, in the course of doing this research and focusing on resilience, focusing on what works, focusing on platforms, mechanisms, and systems that different countries and different communities have to absorb, adapt, and transform in the face of crisis, I came away very hopeful, I think, after finishing this research. Taking a step back, if you look at the slide that I have here, this slide really blew my mind when I first started pulling the data and looking at the trends. This may be very familiar to all of you, but in the light of this research, I found it very enlightening. The international community, the development community that we are all a part of, we have been wildly successful when it comes to poverty reduction worldwide. It has been phenomenal, the rate at which poverty has dropped, particularly since around 2000. You see here, this is the population living on 550 or less than 550 a day, and you see that in the blue trend line there shows that poverty has reduced dramatically across the world. However, there is a pocket of countries that seem to be stuck. This is the last mile in terms of poverty reduction. This pocket of countries affected by conflict and fragility, these have remained, they seem to remain trapped in a vicious cycle. A vicious cycle of poverty on the one hand, and natural and man-made crisis on the other. So in these countries that are affected by fragility, these countries that are affected by conflict, traditional approaches to development have not been able to take root. And in the context of protracted and recurrent crisis, humanitarian efforts have been unable to get ahead of the problem. So what do we do? ISDB, as well as other MDBs and other institutions who are represented here in this panel and elsewhere, have been working over the years to try and develop a new framework, a new approach, a new strategy to crack the puzzle in those countries that are stuck in this vicious cycle. To reach that last mile in poverty reduction worldwide. The emerging solution seems to be one that focuses less on cookie-cutter approaches, less on one-size-fits-all approaches, but rather one that is much more context-specific. Specific to the context in each one of these fragile situations. So each of these countries, no matter how fragile, it can be one that is very fragile, it can be one that is not classified as fragile, but each of these countries has practices, systems, platforms, mechanisms by which society, communities, government manage these pressures and are able to absorb shocks, adapt to change, and transform to major structural changes. So the challenge here is to help donor partners, help ISDB, help those of us who are working on these issues to better understand these systems that exist so that we can support these systems and not undermine these systems. So to that end, ISDB undertook this comprehensive analysis of resilience systems in its member countries, and this has been drafted into a report which will be launched. The report itself, it was very intensive. It involved a major desktop study with quantitative analysis and a lot of field research for 9 case studies in countries, some of which are more affected by fragility and some which are less affected by fragility. So these 9 case studies included Indonesia, Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, Somalia, Palestine, Pakistan, Jordan, and Turkey. And in each of these countries, we identified areas of absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity. This is in line with some of the comments that were made in the last panel. His Excellency, the Vice President, highlighted that absorptive capacity is not resilience. It's not enough to just be able to bounce back from crisis, but resilience includes absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity. So we identified areas of absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity in these 9 different case studies and looked at how donors might support and leverage that resilience in order to break the cycle of poverty and crisis. And the analysis was done across 5 dimensions. As Hugh from OECD mentioned, that their approach is very interdimensional. So in light of that, we took the same approach and looked at 5 different dimensions. We looked at economy and livelihoods. You can see on the slide here. Economy and livelihoods, institutional infrastructural coping capacity, environmental disasters, forced migration, and human security. There's some overlap with their dimensions, but also some differences. And looked at those dimensions and then looked at what kinds of platforms, mechanisms, and practices exist within civil society, private sector, government, community leadership, and religious leadership, but not only within each one of those in isolation, but also what platforms are there for multi-stakeholder collaboration, because these are complex systemic issues, and it is only in collaboration and that these problems can be addressed. So what exists in these countries in terms of social capital, as well as moral capital and human capital and financial capital and political capital? What exists in terms of how to address the pressures across these 5 dimensions?
I think I would have to come back to you later on, at least on the conclusions on the report. But thank you very much. It's interesting how you formulate or resemble resilience as the absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity added together that forms and puts together all the resilience capacity of a specific country. But I've seen also earlier on the first session, actually specifically talking about resilience. A city resilience is as important as a state resilience, and it does happen in many situations where we find, even within a city, some resilient pockets that they manage to survive a certain fragile situation, and community manage and find a way to build themselves. Maybe we need to go and draw some lessons on some of these situations where tribal structures are still maintaining a solid solidarity, that they can support themselves during fragile situations, not only natural disasters but also man-made disasters. I recall on a famine pledging conference to face a famine crisis in the Horn of Africa, one of the heads of states stated that we could not stop drought, but we can stop famine. It is something that looks at how do we build our resilience, because drought is coming anyway. It's a cycle of 10 years, and it will keep hitting us with climate change and everything. But how much are we prepared to face it? Another interesting topic I've seen coming out from a forum that took place in California sometime, it was on addressing September 11 crisis and how the American authorities on the ground that time responded to the crisis. That splitting major utilities and services into small components is more resilient than having it combined into one component. And the simple example was given that it's better to have 10 power plants from a resilient perspective, giving you 100 megawatt each than having one that gives you 1,000 megawatts. The risk of facing fragility, having it concentrated, and that applies to all kinds of utilities and services. What really strikes me, I mean, apart from mentioning on the list of the countries in the report, Palestine did not come out on all the examples, and at least listening to the 5 speakers here, which is the OIC was found because of Al-Quds for us, and the bank was found as an OIC institution later on to serve the OIC countries on that basis. Even on the initial declaration of the establishment of the OIC, that it is current headquarters in Jeddah is a temporary one, with the hope that one day it will move to Al-Quds. But what comes to my mind when we're addressing fragility, and we don't address even Israel, it's a one geographical location, let it be Palestine or Israel, X country, as fragile. Is it fragile or is it resilient? And one writer sees it as 2 countries emerging inside each other, where one is getting into more fragility situation and the other is getting more resilient. So it is something that we need, it would be interesting to see the perspective. But going back to the financial development institutions, when the Syrian crisis started, I was among a team that joined the IsDB, World Bank, and UN team that has established what we call then the MENA Global Financing Facility, or MENA Global, well, MENA Concessional Financing Facility, the CFF, MENA CFF. It was a successful initiative to try and help host countries to build their resilience through an innovative mode of financing, whereby grants are availed together with guarantee facilities to allow the host countries of refugees to be able to absorb the refugees and provide the initial services for development without marginalizing them or undermining their needs, and also without undermining the countries, the host countries themselves. So it does not stop those host countries. The target was obviously Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey at that time, to be able to host that. Only 1 year later, the United Nations, together with the World Bank, has proposed and decided to move it to become a global concessional financing facility, which is the status today. EIB was part of these discussions. The steering committee initially formed of the World Bank, ISDB, and the UN, and then the initial proposal came based on an Islamic financial model, but then EIB and ISDB, EBRD, and others were identified as implementing agencies of this facility. Now, once it has been transferred to global, because once it was first initially specific to MENA, then it moved to global, it means Bangladesh can benefit from the facility for hosting refugees from Rohingyas, from Myanmar. It also means Kenya can benefit from the same facility for hosting Somali refugees, or Ethiopia, or Sudan, South Sudan. So it is in the same format, although we don't hear about it. This facility has almost disappeared today. We had it in the radar for a few years, and the clear evidence that we didn't hear about it today, although the World Bank was represented by the VP, and our VP was there. Walid Abdulwahab was actually my co-member in that steering committee, the moderator of the previous session on setting up that facility. But it's of a concern that we have initiatives that were discussed and prepared to address resilience and fragility, and it was specifically for fragility situations. It was made specifically for one region, then it was made global, and then we forget about it. Let me allow, I see the organizers are trying to push me with time. I'm looking at the time. I know that I have till 4. No? You're not selling any more time? Okay, let's just at least be fair to the floor and get a couple of questions from the floor before we wrap up. Can we have the mic here, please? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Ramadan al-Murhag from Libya, from the Small and Medium Enterprise Program for Libya. I would like to ask the respected panelists, and they all work in Libya, namely OECD, CISRIC, and SPARC. I'm glad to be here. I was wondering, and Libya being perhaps one of the biggest contributors for the ISDB, but unfortunately it's the least recipient. Perhaps Libya is still being treated as a donor country.
Can you? There is a lot of echo. It's not just raise your voice a bit so we are clear what.
Okay.
Sorry.
I was saying that even though Libya is considered one of the biggest contributors to ISDB, but it is the least recipient of ISDB services. Perhaps because Libya is considered as a donor country, as it was prior to 2011. The issue, and the other point is, even when there were some support initiatives, there was an issue of sustainability. So a program starts and a master plan is produced, and then it's not continued on. Perhaps whether it's, I don't know if it's the government as being the counterpart or some other reasons. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Abdu, you look at me. I want to give him an answer. Okay. Sayyid Ramadan, marhaba bika, ahlan wa sahlan, barakallahu fik. I'm also coming from Libya, but I'm also chairing the task force on Libya at the Islamic Development Bank. This question is asked by almost every Libyan, and it's the same question asked by every citizen of another country where they're contributing to the IDB. America is the biggest contributor to the World Bank, but it is the country that does not borrow from the World Bank. And when Libya has contributed to the Islamic Development Bank, it was on the basis of solidarity of supporting these small Muslim countries. Libya is not considered as a borrowing country. Borrowing is not a good thing for the country, by the way. And they only do it when they need it because it increased the debt of the country for many years, and it's against the development of the country itself. Now, however, that does not still address the question what IDB does to help Libya to get out of its current economy, and that is the real question. And so it's not the lending aspect as such, because Saudi Arabia is the biggest contributor to the Islamic Development Bank and the least borrower. The same with the other GCC countries. Libya is the second contributor to the Islamic Development Bank since its inception. Of course, it has not been identified as a borrowing country, but currently there is a special program in the bank looking at what Libya needs. There has been a challenge of getting the structure from within Libya reorganized to identify the needs and the priorities. So it has not been possible to really come up into an agreed priorities countrywide, at least when we talk of major infrastructures and major projects. Of course, there are still been some supports, and there are ongoing initiatives. People don't hear about them. I know that there's a delegation coming from Benghazi University for the reconstruction of the university next week to the bank. We've had the Waqf team coming to the bank a few times, and we have a Waqf program for Libya. We've also had some capacity building initiatives and others. So it's time to, but actually we are waiting for the Libyan official delegation here to address some of those issues. But again, going back to the fragility and resilience situation, I think that need to be addressed more at this stage to be able to allow, it's the same situation with Yemen, to allow the country to really formulate its priorities and identify those priorities vis-a-vis other requirements that the communities need. And this is not the situation only in ISDB, it's the same with the African Development Bank. Libya is also a major contributor, they're not benefiting, same with the World Bank, same with the other institutions. And I'm coming to a bigger umbrella at the heads of the MDBs. We're discussing now the country platforms, and one of the things we're looking at is setting up fragility country platforms among the MDBs to be able to coordinate better their interventions to help countries get out of a fragile situations. So inshallah khair. We have the floor for, yeah, we have a lady, so that's good. Because we didn't have enough balance here, May, on the panel. Huh?
Thank you for a very interesting set of interventions. I'd like to revert back to the panel, if I could, on the humanitarian development nexus. My name is Carol Shushani Sharfain. I work for the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, based in Beirut. And we have a lot of the other side of the equation that also comes into play when we think about the refugee community. And I'd like to ask the panel, in terms of tangible experiences, obviously we need a new way of thinking about development paradigms in the countries of conflict and those facing the effects of conflict. But the host community stories also have to be put into play, because what we are seeing is that while there are very worthy projects focused on the education, employment, and creating opportunities for the refugee communities, there is a very big resistance being felt by the host communities about this. So that's one question I'd like to ask operationally, how you are dealing with this, because we're having strikes and other things that are happening locally. And then the issue of sovereignty. I was very intrigued by the comment that the new facility at the ISDB might be going beyond sovereignty and sovereign financing and finding other mechanisms. A little bit more insight on that would be interesting, as you know, obviously these are intergovernmental processes, and to go beyond sovereignty for financing is an interesting dynamic to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I go back to the panel, I would like to invite the UNICEF representative, Mr. Skander. He's not here, okay. So if that's so, then I would like to give, I'm saying 1 minute. It could be 50 seconds, because Mourouj is giving me fingers from there. Let me start from this end with Abdi. While responding to the questions you've heard from the floor, you can also use the time you have to say one final word. I'm not saying conclusions or recommendations. Just one final word on the submission.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the question. As you have said, linking the humanitarian and development is critical challenge, and it's quite tricky, and it has to be well managed, given that we cannot separate the two, particularly issues that you have mentioned on the refugees and forced displacement vis-a-vis the hosting communities. This is a narrative that we have to change it and see it as an opportunity. If you look at some of the things that have worked, is that MDBs like ISDB has started recently to consider refugees, the issue of refugees, as a long-term development challenge and integrate in the country engagement, development programs and projects. Often our influence as an MDB is very important when we are facing hosting countries, looking at issues that can encourage the hosting countries to address the plight of the refugees that are coming to their countries. And often this is ignored by the development actors, believing that refugees will one way go back to their home countries, and whatever we are giving them is a kind of a transition. However, there are countries that are hosting refugees more than 30 years, like Kenya, hosting Somali refugees, Uganda, Jordan, and Turkey now hosting the Syrian refugees over 7 years or 6 years. This can no longer be treated as a side issue. What we are now introducing together with other MDBs is, and we are part of the Multilateral Development Bank's working group on economic migration and forced displacements, looking at the issues of forced displacement and refugees as a long-term development. And I think that narrative has to change, and we have to create some sort of harmony between the hosting communities and the refugees by providing incentives. And one of the successful incentives, if you allow me, Dr. Al-Wa'ir, that has worked in Jordan is that, for example, the European Union gives the government of Jordan incentives to support the refugees through trade and facilitating international trades. What other MDBs can learn from that, I think, is that ensuring that our development programs like the CFF, we can look at long-term development programs should have refugees and forced displacement lenses. When we are designing programs and projects, we will take into account the needs of hosting communities and, of course, also the refugees themselves. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I wanted to, just before I move on to the second speaker, make sure that what I said about the CFF, for the it's a concessional financing facility. It's still offering sovereign loans. They are not non-sovereign loans, but they are concessional. So they're concessionalized through the grant-based and blending it with the normal, ordinary capital resources from the banks. Of course, the solution of bringing PPP and engaging private sector remains also an option that brings viable solutions. Please, Nate.
Is this the final word?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I just want to say that with regards...
Stop you talking after the session, of course.
Yeah, of course. With regards to the humanitarian and development impacts of refugees, that is something that came up time and time again in all the case studies that we looked at, particularly in Turkey, in Jordan, and I will defer more to Hugh to talk more about that nexus, because that's something that OECD knows a great deal about. As my final word, though, I just want to say that I came away very hopeful because of the areas of success that I learned about. The Minister of Finance from Somalia, in the last session, he spoke about how far Somalia has come, and that is absolutely the case. Just looking at the effect of the drought in 2011, immediately prior to the recognition of the federal government, and the hundreds of thousands that were killed in that drought, as compared to the drought in 2016, which killed thousands as compared to hundreds of thousands, even though the drought itself was was comparable. So resilience is growing. It's certainly growing, and there are examples from all the different case studies we looked at. Indonesia has taken great strides since the tsunami of 2004. Nigeria has done amazing work developing community-based platforms. Turkey did amazing things leveraging the public education sector for social cohesion and psychosocial support. So the work that has been done on resilience has been phenomenal, and the member countries have come a long way, and I look forward to seeing how the ISDB uses this report and these new policies to take a step even further. So I'm very hopeful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so there are statistics on the Syrian refugees which are not usually reported in international statistics, which are more than 5 million. We are implementing some programs for Syrian Palestinians living in Turkey for their reintegration to economic life. This is one thing. For the Libya, for example, we have a very huge project for Libyan program of reconstruction and development, LPRD, and it is for the development of, it includes a dimension of developing SMEs with setting up incubation centers, etc. It's also an initiative that we are providing technical assistance. Well, I could not summarize the potential remedies after my presentation. There are many remedies, but maybe the most important are to invest in human capital. I mean, it is not quite easily destructible. So if you invest in human capital, you increase your resilience much more. And you need to invest in systems and institutions. So if you have solid, strong institutions to tackle every challenges, then you will be more durable and less vulnerable. And to invest all these areas, you need alternative financing mechanism. Of course, it is another dimension that we should not ignore. And Islamic social finance is, I think, one of the most important, crucial instruments that could be mobilized within the OIC region to tackle all these issues, particularly in financing critical investment in those areas. So these are my last words. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, so building on what has been said before, well, I would like to stress again what you mentioned earlier, the Global Concessional Finance Facility, where we are also partnering. We are very much trying now to broaden the scope to broaden it also to private sector investment, because we consider that this is also an important angle where we should see how we can incorporate that into the facility and make there also meaningful investments in order to broaden the scope of the ultimate impact we have under this facility. I think another very important initiative where we as MDBs are teaming up is the migration platform, which was initiated by the World Bank and EIB, and which invited all the other MDBs to join, which is more of a knowledge sharing platform, but which is also important when we are talking about coordination and better focus of our action. And what you mentioned earlier, the country platforms, which is now a new approach where we are trying to better coordinate our action actually in the field. And in that respect, I would like to mention what you referred to earlier. What is very important is really in our action to make a very close and intensive country diagnostic in the countries we are operating in, to really assess the needs of the population, and then to create local ownership of what we do, because it's not, we shouldn't take an approach where we come in and just parachute our action, but it really needs local ownership so that it can go hand in hand with local reforms, with local civil society buying into what we do. So it needs really a comprehensive action and ownership of all of it. That is what I would like to add. Thank you.
Last word. I think I'm with Nate. I think I'm hopeful. I think we increasingly understand more about fragility, and we increasingly have the tools and frameworks to actually start to see that, address it, as we have with poverty over the last 20 years. I think that this making humanitarian action, development interventions, and peace and security actions more coherent is key to this. I think to do that, we need to have a much more common understanding around risk and vulnerability between those actors. I don't think that's been there over the last 10 years. We have different understandings of who is vulnerable. So I think we need to understand together what risk and vulnerability is. And by doing that, we also need to work in the same space at the same time so that humanitarians can do what humanitarian action was designed to do, crisis response. And development, where most of the resources sit, can focus on addressing the longer-term drivers of these crises. So if we can get that right, and if we can get actors working in the same space at the same time, then I think there's hope. But it does involve development actors adjusting the risks that they will tolerate and the risks that they will manage. Lastly, we need the right financing in the right place at the right time. And that's partly up to some of us sitting here on the stage, but not just us and not even us. We need to ensure that aid won't solve it alone, but we need to ensure that aid, whether it's from the banks, whether it's from OECD DAC members, is used catalytically to really drive those big resources. And what I mean by that is private sector, national revenues, ensuring that the tax systems are working properly, foreign direct investment, domestic private sector. So we need to make sure that we finance this properly, and using aid catalytically to drive all of these resource flows into this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it is quite impossible to get this subject really digested in this time. We try to just touch upon the opportunities and challenges. I think in as much as the picture looks gloomy and frightening, there is a great hope that there are solutions and light in the tunnel, and there's a way ahead that we can coordinate more and have our efforts more to hopefully get our people and our countries out of the, what do you call, the traps that they got stuck in. Thank you to all of you for all the contributions. It's been very inspiring, really great, and it gives a lot of ideas, especially on some of the reports and policies the ISDB is still developing, so there is a lot to take in, and we encourage the audiences to communicate with the ISDB team if you have any further questions. They are in touch with the speakers. So we need to remind you that this is a second session out of 3 sessions in a forum that Brother Jamil wanted to throw me out of the. So join me to thank the panel here. Thank you. All the best for the remaining of the session.
Yes. I hope you will stay as well. Yeah, I will. Thank you so much. And by the way, I think before I continue with the session, I would like to make a very simple request. Can you please give a warm applause for your resilience too? You have been waiting and listening patiently, and to our panelists, I would like to say it's great. I have attended several of the side events, and I can say without any fear of contradiction that this is one of the most rich in terms of the quality of content. So thank you very much for this. Can we give them another round of applause, please? Now it's going to be very simple. I'm going to invite 3 different speakers to come provide a case study, but I can assure you it's not going to be long. Each presenter is going to have about 5, maximum 6 minutes to provide a case study, and I'm sure your patience in remaining in the room while these presentations are made will be very valuable. I would like to have the pleasure to invite Mr. Yannick Pou-Pont, if he's in the room, Director, SPAC, International NGOs operating in fragile and conflict-affected situations. I'm sure we are going to hear some very nice, practical case studies. Can we please welcome him onto the stage? So please, you can take and you can use, yeah. Yes, absolutely. Okay. Give you the 5 minutes.
So good afternoon. I realize I'm one of the 3 last speakers standing between you and the coffee after a long day. So we're going to keep it quite quite brief. I prepared, yes, a short, to help me with my speaking points, a short presentation. Now, for those of you who don't know, Spark is it's a non-profit. We work in 17 fragile states. As the statistics before shown, most of them, the vast majority of them, are actually members of the OIC. And we focus on higher education, further education, but primarily on job creation for youth, to help them find their way into a job or start their own company. Maybe we can switch the slide, or if I have a buzzer. No. Yeah, so key to, I think, any solution for tackling the issue of resilience, and maybe this sounds a bit like an open door, and I'm very sorry that you have to keep repeating this. There's actually very strong local partnerships on multiple levels. So you need a very strong cooperation with governments. So we always work very closely with the governments in these countries, their SME agencies, with also the universities, state universities, business centers, to really empower these structures. And after 25 years in this work, I've come to realize that the real result of a project that you do in this field is not the results of the project. It's build basically resilience of institutions, to build the capacity of these institutions. Otherwise, it's just very short-lived. Now, one thing that also came up here with the panel before is that we work a lot with private sector. So, for example, a company like the European insurance company Generali, we're doing a large program on supporting refugees to start up their own companies in Europe and soon in Turkey. A lot with private foundations, philanthropists, and many of our programs actually are pooled funding from, for example, who is present here today, from QFFD and Education Above All, but also the European Union, the Dutch government, Al Nouri Society from Kuwait, Generali. So both philanthropists, governments, East, West, together. And I think that's not only a financial interesting construction, but what I really like about it, it brings different insights, it brings different perspectives and different types of lessons learned. So it's more sophisticated programming. Now, the things we measure, and I will not go into the details, but the things we measure when we talk about resilience building is basically how many jobs are additionally created, what is the value of these jobs, are these decent jobs, or are these just jobs that basically keep people in poverty but don't create much additional value. The things that we've learned at work, and I think this is after a lot of failures also in our own work, I think first of all, we have to start thinking from the market, and it also came with the other speakers, it came up very often, but too often still programs are designed basically offer-driven or educationalist-driven. So I think it's very important we start with analyzing the market. So in all our programs, we start talking to the business people, the business community, to the chambers of commerce, to then design everything towards that. So it means that if you do a training, first see not just what the needs of the market are, but in the case of refugees, also realize what their obstacles are. In some countries, like in Lebanon, if you train a Syrian to become a doctor, it's legally not possible. So better to focus on agriculture, where you can get some permits. A thing that I particularly have been very much closely following with other organizations and our own programs is traineeships. So placing young refugees in companies, but again, based on the real needs of these companies. Again, on seeing that you train them first on what the needs of these companies are, give them an internship, and then try to retain them. I think we have a retention rate of about 40% in Jordan on refugees who do a 3-month internship and then get a 1-year contract. Now, in terms of business development, because it's not only about employability, we have learned that it's much more efficient actually to support existing SMEs, much more value for money, value for your dollar than startups. But we still do startups because I think they are very important to keep hope and to keep basically intrinsic respect of youth that they can attain a goal. Now, I've touched upon the partnerships, which I think are very, very essential in making this all work. I don't think we can all go at this alone. And finally, and I started with that, the localization is so very important. If we don't get ourselves out of a job, and I mean it literally, then we've done a wrong job. And we have a policy of leaving countries after a set number of years. to just leave, and from the beginning build in your local partnerships and make it up, make it clear we are leaving then, so you better be ready because we are handing over. That's another thing I think we need to have much more attention on in this sector. Now, one example, I'll just quickly use two of them. One links actually to the Qatar Fund for Development, where and with education above all in Turkey, where we have been training, or we're in the process of training 2,248 Syrian refugees. And again, I mean, the decision to train them, in this case in agriculture, was taken together with the Syrian Business Alliance that represents 400 Syrian companies. They did a survey, and they looked at where are the needs, what kind of skill sets can we directly place youth in. And we then designed, together with the government, working with the government, we made sure that the training they would get was certified. So not informal, but actually leading to a formal certificate that an employer can recognize. Then work with the local universities and training institutes to provide all the training. And then, of course, do this placement with the Chamber of Commerce. Now, this is another lesson we've learned. You have to make the whole chain. From first your study, what you're going to educate in, to where you're going to place them, and find in each box your partner. Government, Chamber of Commerce, university, and make sure you link it all together. Don't silo it. If you silo it, you don't succeed. Yes, so one thing that together with the ISDB we're doing in Al Nouri Society is placing these kids then in jobs. What's interesting is this quote is actually very common, what we get back from Syrian refugees in this case. They don't just say, I got a job, but they actually also very often say, I got respect and I integrate myself in the local community. I'm now a valuable member of the community, contributing to a host community. So when we talk about supporting youth in jobs in refugee communities, this element actually is a really important, often forgotten additional value besides an income. I had one on Palestine, but I'll just distribute it later. Now, it does not work. I think I already hinted at it. We have to move away from siloed, just education to educate. You have to make the whole value chain. We have to move away from international driven programs and much more localization of programs. I think especially in this field of resilience and job creation, we have to make sure that we do not confuse this with humanitarian and social welfare. But that really we give incentives, but these companies, they have to work. They have to work on their own, because we are leaving as donors at some point. It has to continue, otherwise don't start it. And the final point I wanted to make, and then I'll really hand over, is basically we need, especially with refugees, we need to start working with them from day one on return and reconstruction. And it's very often not possible. In Syria, it's not possible today, but it's about keeping the hope alive, keeping the motivation alive, and just any war will end. I've worked in 8 conflict zones, all of them ended. And what I really did not like is that in each case, peace broke out, I call it. So suddenly all the humanitarians and everybody was, oh my, we have peace. And then the plans were not ready. The people were not ready. So I think we need to start today to plan for reconstruction with the refugees and how to reconstruct their countries. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and for your patience while I'm trying to cut you off, but at least the message is well delivered. I would like to have the pleasure to quickly invite Mr. Misfir Al-Shahwani, please, and Mr. Robert Pasisco. If you can all come to the high table, please, quickly, because we are supposed to leave the room in 10 minutes. So I will give each one of you solid 3 minutes to make his presentation, and then, inshallah, we will conclude. And sorry for the inconvenience. Mr. Al-Shahwani, you want to use here, or are you more comfortable there? Okay, so excellent. Okay, all of the. Okay.
I'd like to make it very short. So since we have only 10 minutes, I would not repeat what all my colleagues saying since 1:30, but I'd like to focus more on things to make it more wrap up or summarize things. And I will focus on the 3 elements basically. The success stories we'd like to share it is the Quest Educations, for example, where all partners, all interesting partners, they're working together, supporting refugees for Syrians. Also, we have a lot of initiatives working with LLF, Lively and Livelihood, regarding with Islamic Development Fund and Bill and Melinda Gates and some of funds from GGC, is to be more proactive, more supporting these countries where there is a potential of refugees will happen. In terms of innovative financing, I'd like to not only stop only in the financing way. We have to see the full cycle of reactions. I'd like to focus more not only in the fundraisings in an innovative way, is also how to deal with it. How the implementer partner of good work, if we see this is a proactive humanitarian crisis, start to be longer. If we are react in the same way that we done in the previous year, will not be success. So we need together as a funders, as a hosting countries, as implementer partners, even refugees, we need to sit together and discuss together how we can offer these challenging. There is really a success stories we've been achieved. We hear it today, but we need to learn from it, and we need to go forward how to compete these challenges. That's I'd like to end up with this my discussion. So to give more to my colleagues' floor. Thank you.
Solid 3 minutes, fully utilized. Robert, another solid 3 minutes.
Thank you. First, raise your hands, those of you who are here. Those of you who ever supported any crowdfunding campaign. Let me see, whoever supported the crowdfunding campaign. And those of you who ever bought any blockchain-based cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoins, Ethereum, Stellar, raise your hands, whoever supported, who has a digital wallet ever. So only the camera guy. Super cool. Okay, so my main question is, why in Netherlands, for example, we have over 10,000 startups and civil society organizations that have been raised up with crowdfunding, and in Egypt we have less than 10. Why there we have more than 10,000 and in Egypt less than 10? So, and this is what we want to change with the UNDP Alternative Finance Lab. Also working with Islamic Development Bank, on which I will point a bit later as well. So in crowdfunding, we are working on many different areas. I would just say that when we talk about crowdfunding, we're talking about something which annually grew from 1 billion in 2011 to expected 300 billion in 2025. So we are talking about, today we are somewhere above $100 billion annually. And different business models. Some are full philanthropy, but some is actually, when we talk about the crowd investment, we're actually talking about the impact investment. So not only donations, but creating impact with our investments. As UNDP, in some countries we developed our own crowdfunding platforms, like in Lebanon. In some countries, like in Somalia, we are supporting NGOs who created their own crowdfunding platforms, or for example teamed up with crowdfunding platforms for renewable energy to create a platform which collected $50 million invested by citizens in renewable energy. Can this approach be used with civil society organizations and NGOs? This is what we are planning to do in cooperation with Islamic Development Bank, but also having our partnership with, which is funded by Qatar Fund for Development. Also 60 accelerator labs in 60 different countries, which are focusing on innovation, and where we are trying to bring new alternative financing models and also other innovation for development by mapping CSOs, making capacity building for them, and joint platform for all of them. So as a conclusion, the next big thing is not something even larger than what exists, but a lot of small things. This is what we can see with all the platforms emerging in the world, very successful business models. Okay, thank you.
I wish in every event I will have speakers like the last three of you. Spot on, isn't it? I will conclude by inviting May Ali Babakir, my sister, to give the closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay.
And bye.
Thank you very much. We have been harassed. We have to go out of the room now. So I'm not going to read my concluding remarks. I just have to say thank you for everybody who made the time to be part of this as a panelist, as moderators, as participants. This was really informative and very interesting for everybody. We count that each one of you will take whatever ideas we shared here outside of this room and continue the discussion. I would like to thank everybody who has been part of this, the organizers, the Human Development Team, Mourouj, Mariam, Mohammed Al-Amin Al-Hadi, Umar, those who have been behind the scene. The interpreters, thank you very much. You have done a good job, and we appreciate your efforts. And thank you all, and have a good evening.